Hi, my name is Jane Trabatore, and I'm really honored to be here at the Bay Area Book Festival's second year. I think we need to give a shout out to Sherilyn Parsons and all of the people who have been putting on the Bay Area Book Festival. In case you haven't been there, the Lacuna sculpture of 50,000 books, I dropped by last night. They finished putting it up last night. It opened at 10 o'clock this morning. 50,000 books free for the taking. Wow. This sculpture will disappear. It's a temple of books. And you can think about the Bay Area Book Festival as embodying and in all spirit becoming a temple of books and authors, honoring the words that make us storytellers and keep us connected with each other as human beings. Today we have Jonathan Lethem and Dana Spiotta. They're going to talk about something that sort of ran through my mind as I've read most of their work, if not all of it, and I've reviewed some of it. And I came up with this blurb, and I'm going to read it because that's what we're all about today. What's real? What's faux? How can you tell? And what makes it art? Two acclaimed novelists talk about Hollywood, Brooklyn, fame, and failure. Punk rock, sci-fi, Ma Bell, phone sex. Authenticity and faking it. Montage, collage, jump cuts, blog posts, texting, sampling, and other ways in which fiction writers envision and encrypt the world we live in. Dana Spiotta is the author of 4 novels, Innocents and Others, which just came out, Stone Arabia, which was a National Book Critics Circle finalist in fiction, Eat the Document, which was a finalist for the National Book Award and a recipient of the Rosenthal Foundation Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and Lightning Field. Spiotta was a Guggenheim Fellow, a New York Foundation for the Arts Fellow, and won the 2008 Rome Prize from the American Academy in Rome. She lives in Syracuse with her daughter Agnes and teaches in the Syracuse University MFA program. Jonathan Lethem is Roy E. Disney, 51, professor of creative writing at Pomona College. He's written 9 novels. The National Book Critics Circle award-winning novel Motherless Brooklyn. And he has 5 collections of stories and essays and a MacArthur grant. His books have been translated into over 30 languages. He says he's just finished a new novel, A Gambler's Anatomy, set in Berlin, Singapore, and Berkeley. So, October, you gotta be looking for this, A Gambler's Anatomy. And Innocents and Others is already out there. He just completed work on an album's worth of lyrics in collaboration with Ree Ronaldo of Sonic Youth. He continues to live in California and Maine, root for the Mets, and help run a tiny used bookstore in Blue Hill, Maine every summer. Okay. I'm going to start by asking Jonathan, and then I'm going to go to Dana with the same essential question. Motherless Brooklyn, your Tourette's detective book, which won an NBC National Book Critics Circle Award, gave us one piece of Brooklyn. Your much longer novel, Fortress of Solitude, is a eulogy of sorts to the Brooklyn you grew up in the 70s. Dissident Gardens covered Queens and the Village, Chronic City, New York City, but still, Brooklyn seems to be your place. How does your time growing up and living in Brooklyn continue to influence the shape of your writing?
Oh, a small question, huh? I'm so much of that place, and it took me a great deal of time, in a way, to back away from it enough to see it. You know, there's the cliche that a fish can't write about the water. And in fact, it was here, of course. I ran away from the East Coast and lived in Berkeley for 10 years and worked at bookstores here and wrote my first few novels, which were about anything but Brooklyn, at least directly. They were set in fantastical worlds, and they were set in the desert West, and to some degree they were set in the Bay Area. My first novel is set in Oakland, but it's in Oakland where there's no San Francisco. I know I'm pandering right now. All that while, it was sort of sorting out for me what it was to have grown up in the time and place I did. Because, of course, Brooklyn then was a completely different thing from what it is now. It has become such a lifestyle concept and a bragging point that I have to always insert a little, skepticism or distance into that, because it's almost sounds like you're, I don't know, it just sounds like you're bragging about going to college at Harvard or something. But when I was coming of age, Brooklyn was a place to get the hell away from. I mean, you really wanted to be over there, across the river, if you could possibly find a way to cross the place decisively, cross the bridge decisively, and never look back. This was the kind of Saturday Night Fever paradigm, right? And this was also true of Brooklyn writers, like Norman Mailer and Robert Stone and Henry Miller, who'd come of age there and gotten it behind them in the rearview mirror and wrote rarely, if ever, about being from that place, because they were looking outward to other things. It was a kind of a lumpen immigrant, not even a melting pot. It was like a forge making you into something capable of getting away. And I guess in a way I wrote in Fortress of Solitude, I wrote a book about being of that Brooklyn and watching the next Brooklyn under construction. That even as I was exiting this fashionable, desirable Brooklyn was perplexingly coming into being, and how screwed up that felt for me. Mm-hmm. The gentrification being a success of all things. Because, in my parents' generation, it wasn't that we didn't have the idea that, these beautiful old buildings could get renovated and they would look so great and these neighborhoods would be so livable, but that it was always a failed gentrification, that it just was never really destined to happen. But at the same time, and I was reminded of this because I was just in a long, wonderful, nostalgic conversation with Ivan Arguelles, Berkeley poet who works at the University Library as well, who lived in that neighborhood when I was a kid, and I was friends with his son. And we were talking about the uncanny quality of cultural richness that was present there, even though everyone felt we were living in a kind of disaster area. And, there were jazz musicians in Fort Greene. Betty Carter was our neighbor, and my father was a painter, and that was not accidental. There were a lot of visual artists, the kind that were too poor to live in Soho, even, to afford Manhattan, had bought brownstones or were occupying these more or less abandoned neighborhoods. Not abandoned. They were full of Dominicans and Puerto Ricans and African Americans, living sometimes in rooming house fashion. One of the things that was hard to explain about the difference between then and now is the population of Brooklyn was actually immensely higher, or those portions of Brooklyn, because you'd have 30 people living in a brownstone that now a family of 5 would occupy. But there were also a lot of sealed up buildings. My playgrounds when I was a kid were abandoned, bricked up facades that had crumbling staircases that we could, risk our lives on. It was an intense time in New York City. I'm talking a lot, I'll stop soon. This has been documented now a million different ways and commemorated by things like Patti Smith's memoir, but it was real. There was this chaotic, turbulent sense of potentiality in the dystopian New York, the abandoned New York of, Abe Beam's New York, Gerald Ford to City, Drop Dead. This kind of Son of Sam atmosphere was a really amazing place to grow up, but it was also traumatizing and confusing, and I had to manage it for a long time. And there's a reason that Fortress of Solitude is not my first novel. It's my 6th novel. I had to really develop both literary tools to grapple with this fecundity, but also emotional, psychological passages I had to go through in order to be able to think, about this part of my life, without just a sense of drowning in the complexities and the contradictions of that place.
You're bringing it back to mind. I saw you accept an award at the Brooklyn Book Fair last year on behalf of Brooklyn. It was quite wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've become like the guy who can't ever leave, even now. I tried over and over again to kind of like be somebody else, and yet Brooklyn has its, absolutely, it's a premature all over me, and I'm always forced to give it up to that.
Yes, they bring you back. Yeah. They give you honors. Thank you. I'm going to move on to Dana for an opening statement. Dana's written 3 novels. Your first novel, about LA. Your first 3 of your novels, Lightning Field, your first, your National Book Critics Circle Award finalist, Stone Arabia, and your new novel, Innocents and Others, are set in LA and deal with Hollywood. I want Dana please to describe your own formative years there and why you continue to be drawn to writing about that place and the film industry.
Well, I mean, and actually in Eat the Document, there's some LA scenes too. So actually all four, right? But I think it's, I didn't really, we moved around a lot when I was growing up. So a lot on the East Coast. We lived in Illinois, we lived in Connecticut, we lived in Northern California. I actually lived in Orinda, California for a couple of years. And we were always in suburbs, always. And it always felt kind of the same. There was a sameness to it. Even when we went abroad for a year and we lived in Italy, we lived in EUR, which is a suburb of Rome. And I just was always in suburbs. And so we moved to Los Angeles, and I went to high school in Los Angeles, and that was the first city that I really lived in. And I think that was a big change for me, because I don't think I really liked living in the suburbs very much, and I liked living in the city, and I was very interested in the architecture and the geography of it, and I was very interested in films, and here was this place that had this history, this kind of secret history everywhere that could be read, and it just felt like an interesting, it inspired me. And so, and then my family stayed there for many years. My dad moved to Topanga Canyon, so I would go and visit him there. My mom moved to Santa Clarita, which is a suburb of Los Angeles, and so I would always come back and visit, and I think that that sort of being away, living in New York City, and then coming back to Los Angeles, it kind of gave it to me, that exile that you were describing, that Jonathan was describing, where you could sort of see it more. And other than that, it's sort of mysterious. I mean, I write a lot more about upstate New York now. I find central New York to be a very interesting place with a whole other kinds of history. And again, it's not a very suburban place. It's a really, but it's a strange place. And so, so that's creeping more and more into my work. Stone Arabia is a place in upstate New York, and there's a lot in Innocents and Others that takes place in central New York as well. Even Syracuse makes an appearance in there. So yeah, sort of they come up in these mysterious ways, and I don't know if I'll ever write about Los Angeles again. I mean, maybe I will. But I feel a little bit like a little fraudulent, because I really am. There are actually people who grew up in California, and I'm not one of them.
Not
really,
a native.
I'm really like an interloper. Yeah, in that way.
Not a native. I pointed out at one point, I realized they've swapped coasts now, because you're in Pomona and you're in Syracuse.
Yeah.
But you go back and forth.
I've ended up going back and forth. I basically spent my 20s living in Berkeley and Oakland.
Yeah.
Then I went back to Brooklyn for what seemed like, this sort of like, Brooklyn boy makes good and returns. And then I took this job in Southern California now at Pomona College. But I'm going to challenge your thing about that the person who really grew up there, the born in LA person or the born in Brooklyn person, because one of my observations about New York is, I think in a way that city is defined, and this is a very American thing, not by the deep provenance of having been born there, but by people who come from the provinces and claim it.
Right.
Like in a way, the ultimate New Yorker is someone like Dawn Powell,
right,
or Andy Warhol, or Truman Capote, who cites it from the distance and says, that's where life is. And then they go and they like embody it in a way with less ambivalence than the born in New Yorker.
Right.
I've always kind of seen it as as much a burden or a problem as a kind of a party to be celebrated. But it's that person who comes and locks onto it.
Right.
And LA may equally be defined by the emigre to LA.
Well, I think that's the classic thing about LA is they used to say, oh, no one was ever born here, right? Like people just come here and there's no such thing. And of course, over time that can't be true. And I do think also that there's another thing about sensibility and the age you form sensibility. And I think there was a time where, and you write about this too, there's a for me, what you love in terms of art, especially maybe because I moved around so much, so that I was very, didn't have a tremendous group of friends, but I read a lot and I saw a lot of movies and I listened to a lot of music. And those years, between say 12 and 17, were really kind of, I came alive as a, my identity came alive, and I was absorbing on every level. And so the place I happened to be really imprinted on me in this dramatic way. And I think that's partially adolescence. You're sort of imprinting.
Yeah, it's like the songs that were on the radio.
Yes, the things you watch. And I do think the amount of memories you accumulate at that age, your per minute memories are much higher than they are from, say, 30 to 40, you're just so it feels very vivid to me. The 70s feel vivid and the 80s feel vivid in a way that the 90s just don't feel vivid to me.
So both of you use music, you use film, you use drugs, you got all the stuff that is going on.
Wait, we don't use drugs.
In your work, in the work you use these things that are part of the culture of those times. How do you access it when you're sitting at the desk?
Oh, by using music and drugs.
Using music.
No, I mean, honestly, I do evoke it with just, surround, of course.
Shattered.
I try to.
Shattered.
I played Shattered 1,000 times when I was writing Chronic City. But, this is a particular, I have like a weird talismanic fixation on finding the emblematic song or songs that go with a book I'm writing, and then I'll and sometimes it's as on the nose as playing the Rolling Stones' Shattered while writing about Manhattan as a unsustainable illusion, intellectual set of constructions that can't be sustained. On the other hand, it might be indirect, like there was a John Cale song called Dying on the Vine that was the totemic emotional keystone thing for a book called Girl in Landscape, and I still can't explain why that song put me where I needed to be for that book, but it was just a way of invoking the kind of emotional disquiet that I wanted to write about.
I'd love it if you read 2 sentences from Chronic City.
Sure.
Because you just said something, the rhythm's in here, but I don't know if you can follow my underlining.
Try. Okay. Oh yeah, I see it.
You would recognize
the New York subway is a vast, disordered mind, obsessing in ruts carved by trauma a century earlier. And then you want the next one.
Yeah.
This is about the house the mayor lives in my book. He's a quasi Bloomberg, is a billionaire mayor. Money had its solvent powers, could dissolve the rear walls of a 19th century townhouse to throw a dining room into what must have been the backyard, under a glass atrium that now worked as a blizzardy planetarium.
Dana, when you were writing Stone Arabia, you wrote about a musician who becomes not a musician who made himself famous, but who became a documentary character based on who he thinks he could have been. Mm-hmm. What kind of music were you thinking about at that time?
This is in this book. I did have a ton of music that I was listening to, of kind of outsider artists maybe who are. When I'm working on a novel, I do kind of think about all the stuff that I want to put into it. I think of it as a sort of funnel in which everything goes in. And so, everything I'm watching, movies I'm watching, music I'm listening to, and books that I'm reading pertain to the novel. And in this one, it was listening to not just with Eat the Document, I was listening to the Beach Boys and kind of like a lot of lost albums by famous musicians. And in Stone Arabia, I was mostly listening to sort of Daniel Johnston, kind of like more obscure cult kind of music. But I was also doing this thing where, because Nick, the main character, is creating an invented life for himself, I was trying to think of what he was referring to. So I had a kind of doubleness there. So when he was doing his solo album, I was thinking of Paul McCartney's first album, which he made on a 4-track tape. And so I knew that Nick would just sort of think of that as a prototype because of his age and when he was. So I had to have my fake albums be Nick's fake albums of somebody else. So there was like this double fakeness that had to happen through the book. So that was kind of an interesting thing. And it was weird to me, and a lot of it's very hidden, but it's weird to me how many people figured out what all those things were. Like they figured out, oh, that's Leonard Cohen, or that's Bob Dylan, that's Paul McCartney, that's Big Star, you know. And I thought I was just being true to the character and covert in a way that would make the character real for me, but you would never get the references. But there are a lot of music nerds out there. So I was glad that they worked, but it was conjured for this realism of this character, you know.
You two also are very good at covering the technology of music and the technology of film. Do you go back and find the old Ma Bell phones, or you know the X-track tapes, or do you have them left over? Or I mean, there's a lot of detail about the instruments of technology in both of your work.
That's a very interesting thing to think about. Yeah, I mean, I guess I do have some of that clutter left over. One of my obsessions, and this doesn't even have to, this gets outside of music or even outside of realist depictions. One of my fixations is the way new technologies enter our, like our somatic space. They brush up against our bodies and become part of the clutter of life. Like things that you read about or see, you know, projected by philosophers or science fiction writers or futurists, and then the reality of what comes to your house, and you actually have like virtual reality goggles, which is a thing we've been asked to think about for 30 years here in the Bay Area especially, right? They have this like super esoteric, they're going to like exalt you into this other kind of life where all of your normal stuff will not matter. But when the day comes that your New York Times subscription delivers you this cardboard folder thing that you put on your kid's head, and you slip your iPhone into it, and then he walks around with like cardboard and your iPhone strapped to his head. That's like how it actually occurs, right? And it's always so much more weirdly homely and charming, but useless. And you know, so like in my first novel, I have anti-gravity exists in Gun with Occasional Music, but the only form it exists in is that there's this pharmaceutical company that gives out as a gimmick, so you'll take it home, an anti-gravity pen. It's a bad ballpoint pen. The ink doesn't work very well. It's as bad as any ballpoint pen you've ever been given, but it is anti-gravity, so when you put it on your desk, it kind of floats up a little bit, and you're always looking for your pen, and then it's up here, right? And I just think, you know, this, of course, connects also to the world of like books, right? Books are this incredibly homely technology that has rooted itself into our bodies, almost like, you know, I don't feel really good unless I have one in a pocket somewhere, and I like rooms full of books. They make me feel like I can rest capably, and you know, we need them. We're like physically all kind of mushed up with this technology, such that we don't think of it as a technology anymore. And in fact, then we're very threatened. Someone invents like an eye reader, and we're like, I don't want technology to take away my book. You know, well, it's just a rival. And in fact, rival technologies, like rival art mediums, tend never to displace one another completely.
Right.
You know, early films were all like film theater, and everyone was in a panic anyway. And we still, you know, Berkeley Rep is down the block, and like we have email, but a lot of people still have fax machines in their house. How bizarre is that weird scrap of technology stuck and won't dislodge completely, right? And so this kind of weird homely multiplicity of like 8-track cassettes and, you know, I mean, making mixtapes, which is both a really lost thing and a really available thing. Now we all make them because we make playlists for each other. But then the specific thing of like having a device that had 2 cassette players in your house, so you'd like match them up and do a reel-to-reel. I would make mixtapes from cassette to cassette, which was basically the most labor-intensive art medium.
Smiling,
yeah,
grinning,
but I would do this thing, and I would do it, you know, routinely.
Yeah, but I think there's something about when somebody would make you a mixtape, and you know, and I'm not necessarily nostalgic for this because you know I embrace the efficiency of making a playlist, but at the same time, and having everything accessible to you, it represented something very specific. One, it was their devotion to you, right? Because they were going to do this labor-intensive thing, and it was usually handwritten, and sometimes it would have like a little collage or drawing or whatever, or photograph you cut out, or mimeographed or or photocopied. And then it also was what they had in their collection, right?
Right.
So it was kind of like you were showing your cards, like, look at this, I've got this weird Roxy Music bootleg, and now you just would get it from, wherever.
Everything
is everywhere.
Yeah.
Some of it was this kind of exclusivity, preciousness thing, but it was a way of communicating your sensibility to a certain extent. And that's changed. And I guess I'm interested in just how it's changed, right? So not so much saying it was better then, or it's better now, or this is a problem, or I hate this. I try to resist that crankiness. And it's more about just being able to see what's right in your life. So we embrace this technology, and it's very hard to understand it because we use it constantly. And we embrace it, and only years later do we realize, oh, we all started carrying around iPhones, and that's when everybody stopped talking to each other. If only we knew then. And so there's that whole feeling that we're embracing this stuff that's beyond our ability to understand it. And so sometimes I think just dislocating it a little bit, going off kilter to sort of like the recent past and thinking about, so the origins of the social media impulse was what? Or the origins of this kind of weird internet catfishing was this other thing, or this origins of this. And you sort of kind of go to the past and find the roots of it. And I think that obsolete technology and discarded technology tells you so much about where we are now. And I think I kind of got that, remember it was like in Infinite Jest where he talks about the video phone. Was it Infinite Jest, I think? Yeah, and it's interesting to see sort of, and as Jonathan says, it's never a straight line with technology, right? And there's there's a moment in my book where she's at the Mohawk River, and she sees the Erie Canal there, and she sees the railroad, which is still being used, and then I-90, and it's just like this timeline of sort of abandoned technology, except that it's all there to be read, and sort of as a map of who we are as a culture. So I think technology is one of those things that shapes us profoundly, and so it'd be hard not to write about it if you're interested in these things that are external to us.
But I completely agree that it's very treacherous, almost hopeless to write about the very current one in their current form, because you don't have any handle on it. But when you estrange it backwards slightly, I mean, in Chronic City, I wanted to write about the life of the screen, but I had to make my characters absurdly stupid about computers in order to write about what I wanted to. And I ended up, instead of some super virtual of the moment thing, I wrote about their relationship to eBay. Just the idea that there was a phantom store where they could shop, and that they were trying to understand, like, do I get to take the merchandise from the store? Oh no, somebody else reached in and grabbed it and stole it from me. Like that was the amount of virtuality that I could actually get onto the page and say what I needed to say about it.
Also, Dana, I'm thinking about the phone freak you have in your current novel, Jelly, who gets to know about phone freaking. Where did you hear about phone freaking? It's really, do you know about phone freaks?
All right, so phone freaking is I always feel like I'm always saying proto this, proto that, but it's hacking with telephones, and it was done in the early 70s, and Steve Jobs and Wozniak and your people here in Northern California that were really into doing this in college, and they had these blue boxes, and by tones, because this phone system used to be run by tones, you could make long distance calls, you could talk to people on open lines, you could do all sorts of things. And it was really, what was beautiful about it, I thought, is that it really had no purpose. It was just for the sake of doing what we shouldn't be doing, which is messing with Ma Bell, right? And they hated it. And it was really like people would go to jail and they had to use different names. And it was a kind of proto-internet in a way, on a small scale. And it was, anyway, so the way I found out about it was I was reading the obituaries. I read obituaries. And I read about this guy, Joy Bubbles, who was one of these original phone freakers, but he was in a special category because he was blind and he had perfect pitch. He was 6 foot something. He was this unusual guy. He wasn't one of these college guys, right? He was a genius, but he was sort of, an autodidact kind of phone freaker. And they all needed these blue boxes, but he could do it by whistling. And so, and he didn't want to talk to anybody. He just wanted to listen to the phone sound. He loved the phone. The phone made him happy. The sounds it made him happy. The clicks, the beeps, the everything. So when I was writing about this, I did end up, and what's great is on YouTube, you can put in a specific phone from a specific time period, and some genius in the open source geniusness of the universe has just given you that. You can hear what a dial tone sounded like in 1978. You can hear what a rotary phone, this specific, it just like, you know, the world just gives you this. How did anybody write a novel before the internet? And, but I also get the actual phones that I write about, because there's the thinginess, which we've talked about this before, the thinginess of the technology, which sometimes gets lost. We think about technology in this abstract way, right? It's a tool that does this thing, right? I use it for this. But actually, it's just like a sweaty thing in your hand, right? It's a piece of plastic, and it feels this way on your cheek, and it makes this noise, and there's all these sense concreteness. And if you're going to write about it in fiction, you've got to bring that in, because it's got to be how it affects your body and how you use it in your... What does it feel like when you've been on the internet? Oh, you want me to read that? Okay.
I have to confess, this is the graph that was cut from my NPR interview of her book because it was too long. So there's a secret meaning, but this is the voice. This is what we're talking about, and the sensuality that you're describing in the book for one long little paragraph.
She lay back on the pillow, held the phone so it barely touched her cheek. She imagined her voice going into the transmitter, sound waves being turned into electrical impulses up the wires to the phone lines to the switching station, turned into microwaves speeding across the country with the memory, the imprint of her exact tone, her high and low frequencies, her elegant modulations, to the switching station in Santa Monica, to the Malibu beach house, and into Jack's receiver.
So that's how this thinking goes into beautiful sentence. Huh? Anyway. Go ahead. Sorry. I'm grabbing both of you, and I gave you sentences, and thank you very much. I wanted each of them to have a little of the fiction
but also
in this discussion.
You know, what you remind me of in our generation of the relationship to the phone as a kind of proto-internet. Mm-hmm. You know, prank calling.
Yes.
And just simply that point as a teenager when you realize you can flip open the phone book and talk to strangers, and some of them will stay in the conversation for a while. If you don't, you know, go for the like rude punchline too quickly, you could actually get enmeshed. This is the first enactment of this virtuality where people are representing themselves, you know, behind, you know, through an electronic screen.
Yeah, and it's no wonder that it became that use of the phone became obsolete pretty fast, because I mean this idea that the phone would ring and you have no idea who it is. That couldn't stand. We'd have to get caller ID soon, and we'd have to be able to screen our calls and that weird thing where you're sort of not ever directly reachable. That didn't used to be the case. Like, if you hear the phone ring in the middle of the night, you get up because somebody died or somebody's in trouble or whatever. And it's a different. That's changed to a certain.
Well, so this reminds me of something that, you know, like so many things have their, you know, their prototype, their version that, you know, makes them not as new as they look, right?
Right.
But then there are changes, and one of the changes, and this corresponds to this, is the death of the synchronous experience.
Right.
That we live in a great regime of the asynchronous. That no one wants to go to the movies because the movie now starts at 7:20 and everyone's like, I want to watch it when I want to watch it.
Right.
And I don't want to pick up the phone when it rings. I want to look at the text and answer it when I want to answer it. So there's no longer the synchronous imperative in our media. Instead, it's select your time. Right. Yeah. And that's really different.
Yeah, that is really different. Those are like the little, you know, the trying to be precise about how something's changed over time, I think, is an interesting thing to you know, track sort of culturally where we're moving. And also maybe that gives us some insight into what choices we're making without even realizing we're making choices right now. When we say, you know, to our children, here, take this, you know, amazing device and, you know, go entertain yourself with it so I can do some work. And, you know, wonder what happens.
Both of you are choosing not to do traditional realistic fiction. You have moments where you have sections that are in the form of liner notes, for instance, or in the form of a website about women in film. Can you talk a little bit about how you began to make the choice not to do realistic film, and what it is you're showing and what influences there may have been? We've talked with Philip K. Dick as one of your big influences.
Yeah.
Sebald is
well, I
one
mean,
of you.
right. So different things are coming to meet in that question, right? Yeah. I mean, the use of kind of documentary elements or ostensible
right.
archival evidence, the intrusion of other media into the novel is a kind of obviously you're forced into using the word postmodern. It's a clear development in the history of the novel, and we're participating in that.
Sure.
But
it's been there before, way before we got there.
Completely.
Yeah, you're doing it in a new way.
We're just, that's why I use the word participant.
Right.
And
you guys.
and I think it's a very agreeable one, and I think with relief, the audience recognizes it without any friction or static. It's like we get that now the novel has gobbled that up, right? Which is, to me, the most attractive thing about the form we both work in is it's the most encompassing, welcoming, and sort of omnivorous art form. You can paraphrase all kinds of other things inside of it.
Yeah.
Very readily.
It's extremely elastic.
Baggy.
Yeah.
But so, I mean, the other thing, realism versus other things, anti-realisms or surrealism. I mean, I've always felt that there was a great problem around the idea of realism in the literary arts, at least in my experience of it, which is that it contained all kinds of formalities, but that they lied about their constructed nature. That the very fact that we take it for granted that characters can be on the page, walking in and out of rooms and saying things, is a ridiculously Baroque art form. It's like a sonnet or something.
Right.
It's a construction. So I never could consent that there was a kind of a purity or a naturalism that was just the default mode for anything. That didn't make sense to me. So I wanted to foreground the fact that everything in it is a choice and everything in it is But I also have an even bigger, more probably obnoxious declaration to make, which is that I just think that the thing about reality is that it contains, like the novel can contain all kinds of other things. Reality contains, in my experience of it, a lot of the unreal. The dream life, the projection, the fantasy, the discontinuities, the subjectivities that never concur. And so, to me, the higher realism, to use the obnoxious term of realism, is one that engulfs a lot of the surreal or the unreal, because that's how we experience things. They're not simply stolidly prosaic and, you can hammer on everything and prove it's there. We walk around all the time in the grip of ideology and fantasy and untruth and I just think that for me to say anything useful at all, I have to say some of that too.
Mm-hmm. And I would completely agree with Jonathan. I would just say that this idea of realism is really this kind of invisible, maybe where it's fiction, where there's enough of the conventions of realism where you're not as conscious of it, but these are still just conventions. And I'm thinking about, I teach. When James Joyce was writing Ulysses, he was really thinking about the conventions of the Victorian novel and throwing those away. And it was in the name of realism that you would come up with stream of consciousness, or that you would come up with these formal innovations, because that really is much more like the brain, how it feels to be a person in the early 20th century than the Victorian novel conventions, which he needed to throw away. So I'm asking myself the question, what's it like to be alive now, or in the near now, or in the recent now? And what are the things that it feels like? And part of it feels like, you've got this and you've got that, and you've got all these different sort of fragments that come together and have these connections, and they move horizontally, and they're not always driven by these kind of narrative conventions, which to me feel like the realism that somebody else used to describe that I need to kind of reinvent. It's sort of my obligation to reinvent. So it feels like a kind of hyper-realism to me. And any deformations come out of an attempt to be more true to what it's like to be alive. And sometimes that requires this weirdness. And also I think just being able to, if something's been done before, it gets read as a received idea, and this kind of, it's hard to engage it. So if you want somebody to look at something in a new way, you've got to put it in a new context. You've got to decontextualize it or put it in an alien place. And so sometimes those weirdness of form comes out of just trying to see something in a new way that's familiar, and you want to be able to see it with new eyes. And so you have to kind of dislocate it, again, to use that word.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Great.
Like the website.
Like a
website with a faux story of my girlhood. That's
Yes.
the opening of the new novel.
And there are, and there's links that don't work because it's a novel. Yeah. So there's part of it
comments.
And comments
and
comments. And it says
comments.
expand more and you can't expand more. And, some of the stuff you don't want it to be gimmicky. It has to be driven by an organic need of the novel. But on the other hand, I don't want to pretend that this is the same world of 20 years. This is the world we live in. I mean, most of us spend most of our time on a device. I mean, why would a novelist pretend that's not true? If you're writing about today. So I try to put it in there, but not just to be kind of cute, And I do think the novel is interesting in that I do think it's miraculous that you can just use prose. And I'm not like, I think that one of those discarded technologies is like the hyperlink novel, which thank God that went away. I do think that this prose on the page that can pretend to be a movie and can create all these seductions of and versions of the world that we exist. I mean, that to me is the thing that drives me to it and makes me excited about it, is that it seems the infinite possibility of the form.
Yeah, and
as it is.
At the same time, the oneness that I didn't get to the end of your first chapter and want to follow the links. I wanted to read your next chapter. Mm-hmm. And, it's like you don't really want to be in love with 12 people.
Right.
You want to be in love with one person who's so amazing that they're just like, oh, other people seem really redundant at that point, right?
Right.
And a novel, at the same time as it's so capacious, it's like this outstanding mind meld. It's you and that novelist's voice, and when it's working, you don't want anything else. You want to just be in that brain space and figure it out and live with it and savor it, when it's at its best.
And that long looking that the novel gives you, both as a reader and as a writer, but particularly as a reader, where you're engaged with one person's thing, that to me feels like a dissident work of art these days, because there's very little that just kind of goes in one direction and has that deep concentration. It does feel like a counter force to the way that information is normally these days accessed by most of us, right? I mean, when you're reading the New York Times now, you're clicking to this and you're noticing that and you're being interrupted and you're checking your phone, and you're checking your email. And when you shut that off and you get absorbed in a novel, and that one-on-one between you and the writer, and it's very interactive, it's building on your memories and your experiences. That experience happens, less and less frequently. It's like going to the movies and seeing a movie in the theater with other people, where you can't pause it, and you can't check your phone, and you can't look it up. I gotta look up and see what that actor was in. No, you don't. You're just watching the movie. You do not. You can check later. And it takes you a minute to and you're in that theater, and the lights go down, and there's something sacred about that now, that experience. And you have to be there at the time it starts. You got to show up, and you got to be ready, and you're with all these strangers, and you're all going to laugh at the funny parts and cry at the sad parts together in this weird. That is not the same as watching at home and pausing it and looking up stuff on IMDb.
Streaming it while
Not
you're
the
doing
same.
other things.
So those experiences are going to exist, and they're going to exist as a countercultural experience, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So another thing that's come up in the digital world is the possibility of falsifying, very easily falsifying. And in some of the things that you've been dealing with, Dana, you're actually creating faux documentaries or faux website information. Mm-hmm. And when you're a novelist writing scenes about characters, and then you're doing the faux, and you're asking in a way what's real and how can we tell, and it's hard to tell right now. When you go on, you look at the news and you go, wait a minute, who put that up there, and where did I find it, and what's the image? It's hard to find what's real. Mm-hmm. But you're writing a fiction about how to figure that out.
Yeah. It's interesting. I was teaching Ragtime, the Dr. O book, and it's one of those books where he doesn't have any acknowledgments at the end. It's now become sort of the convention that if you write a novel, you put in where you got all this stuff from, right? And I do that, and I like it when other writers do that, because sometimes I want to know where the stuff comes from. But Doctor does just nothing, and so when you're reading it, you really don't know what he made up and what's real. And almost always the weirdest stuff is the stuff he didn't make up, like the baseball player who I don't remember that there's he does these little tiny mini bios in it, and there's this baseball player who is kind of like a token, a mascot. for one of the New York baseball teams, and it just seemed insane, and he ends up going crazy. He gets to play one time, it ruins his life, and you're thinking, can't be true. That's the true part, right? And the stuff that's made up is the more seemingly realistic and seamless stuff. And so, it's always been that fiction will, use the strategy of putting a real movie next to a fake movie in the fiction and trying to make those things seamless.
Although Ragtime, which won the first ever National Book Critics Circle Award in fiction, at the time it was presented, it was controversial because it had real people in it. Had real
yes, and not only that,
said this isn't fiction,
and not
so
only
that was a moment.
But it's
way behind us.
It's way important moment, and it's an important moment. Sorry, it's such a great book, but it's also it had like real people doing made up stuff, like Emma Goldman seducing, like in a sex scene, essentially, which I'm pretty sure didn't happen. But when you're reading it, you don't think it happened, right? So and yet then the strike being presented exactly as what happened, right? And so I think that mixing did upset people a lot, and we've kind of, that's long in the past now, that mixing in that way. But I think when it's called a novel, when it's called fiction, you should believe that. That should be what it is. It's fiction.
But I'll also problematize this a little bit, because the origins of the novel, it is a disreputable form. We constantly acting like it's some sort of, highbrow form innately, and it's very typical to be intimidated by the novelist as a sort of commanding, aristocratic figure. But the origins of it are in all sorts of weird deceptions, like Defoe pretending that he's publishing journals, and people publishing anonymous narratives of country gentlemen or coming-of-age stories. And this was very much in its DNA, was this kind of slippage.
Yes.
That is part of why it actually took quite a long time for it to become something that had a noble cast. It was actually seen as a kind of very, very mongrel and scrappy literary form, one that was suspect in all sorts of ways.
I think fiction is still viewed that way, don't you think? Yeah. I mean, you were talking about Seybold, and he brings in the photographs, right? And it's interesting because it's, some of the photographs are of what they purport to be, and some of them are not. And it's not that hard to find out which are fake and which are real. And does he want you to look them up? They're not captioned. They're not credited. Some he's taken, some he's found. And I think he's just trying to destabilize you and make you sort of, you're not, he doesn't really, whose aim was not to get you lost in an invisible narrative dream. He really wants you to feel destabilized, because he's writing about this kind of, this post-war destabilization where people don't feel at home anywhere. He doesn't want you to feel at home in his book. He wants you to be anxious as you're reading it about what's real and what's not, because he's talking about erasure, he's talking about forgetting, he's talking about people who've been obliterated, right? So, and how you go on when you don't even know what happened in the past. That amnesia that he's writing about, that post-war European amnesia. So I think he's creating formally a kind of hyper-realism of destabilization, that he wants a tension in the novel that's not it's not built of plot, which is usually where tension comes out of, right? Plot. He's building it out of form. And it's not, I don't know. It's definitely always been done, right?
Yeah.
But if you look at what's going on right now and what you guys are writing about, which feels very, to me, among the most 21st century novels, you were among the two writing Where We Are Now. Are we not in a destabilized period? And are we not feeling destabilized, most of us, all the time? It's pretty.
Well, and I think what you're also referring to, and at least to get back to your original question, is that this idea of identity that we now have, it's sort of accepted and part of our lives to create fictional selves and fictional identities and profiles out of photographs, whether it's on Instagram or on Facebook or on Twitter. You're always doing this presentation of self, which used to not be something that everybody did all the time, right? And
we just done a book tour.
Yes. Yeah.
For the few.
Yeah. So
now everybody's famous.
Now everybody is is presenting themselves and curating their lives for others, for the viewing of others. Not everyone, but many people are, right? Mm-hmm. And that's new, and that's particular to this moment, it seems to me.
Yeah, I agree, but I also think that there can be a tendency now to kind of whether it's celebratory or as a kind of whether it's denounced, to flatter ourselves for being the first fragmented humans. And actually, I think the condition may somewhat precede our present technologies and our present social experience, right?
Oh, come on!
And so I think there are lots of examples you can find of people sorting through. I mean, I've been reading Musil's *The Man Without Qualities*, which is about the problem of self in 1913 Vienna, before World War I, and the destabilizations and the pressures of identity, pressures on identity of various kinds of modernity at that time, technological, the sort of early version of McLuhan's Global Village, where you pick up the newspaper in Vienna and you learn about people starving in China and you don't know what it means to your state of being.
Right.
And also the fragmentation of old aristocracies and empires and hierarchies that told you what you were.
Right.
These are things that, fortunately, I mean, I'm sort of bragging on behalf of the novel here, but I think fortunately novelists have been contending with for a lot longer than internet theorists have been.
Right.
And we can turn to these other versions of this kind of navigation and negotiation to, first of all, knock down our vanity that we're the first people to suffer this sort of thing. That is it's like a faux sophistication that turns all of the past into sentimental, halcyon time when everyone understood what to do and how to be, which is a very Bethetic approach to have towards all of human history,
right,
before 1997 or something.
Yeah, I mean, you could look at the Erie Canal as the internet too. I mean, the velocity, anything that would increase velocity, destabilize people, right? Like you could suddenly get from A to B much more quickly, and information, anything that, and technology always tends to be about velocity. Like it tends to be like we're always trying to go faster. We're always trying to move between spaces as fast as we possibly can, and that does tend to, that's something that's been causing destabilization or this feeling of fragmentation for a long time, and it's what modernism was kind of built to address, right? Yeah.
But you both have a political themes or political material in your novels, and that's something that isn't always the case. And I'm wondering how you consider political material as you're weaving it into fiction.
Well, I mean, I think of my work as helplessly and innately political, because I think when you begin to participate in human discourse, to write a novel, you're going to end up making inadvertent or associative kind of political gestures all over the place. And for me, I just felt that was okay. It was native to me because my parents were so political and instilled in me a sense that it was a necessary part of being human and being an artist. My father's paintings had political content that was overt. But I mean, I don't think many people would have taken a lot of my earlier works for being about politics, because people can be quite literal, and if they don't see the depictions of right, center, and left, or of capitalism or communism under those names appearing in the fiction, they'll think, oh, this is a story. It's about these people. Well, I always thought, of course, there were political implications. And ironically, when I finally got to Dissident Gardens, which is a sort of explosion of overt reference to political legacies, I thought, this is no more political, and maybe, in fact, slightly less political than some of my other writing. It's about the human condition of living under the necessary state that I was just describing, that we are all political, but it was basically about that as a emotional crisis. Whereas Chronic City, which doesn't name its politics at all, to me was like a scream of rage against capitalism and against the way that 9/11 had been interpreted in favor, essentially, of the West. And that book was a kind of a political battle cry, but there was when I looked behind me, no one was marching. And then I wrote a book that to me was about human beings who happened, in a sense, to be saddled with political legacies and that wasn't making a direct assertion politically in one direction or another. I found myself in all sorts of conversations about politics. But I think it's always there.
It's always there. Dana, most recently, in your new book, you have the documentary filmmaker who's going back to various Kent State and
the dirty
Argentinian dirty wars, and that's political material, and she's going back and looking at it a new way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I agree with Jonathan. It feels, all the books feel political, particularly in the sense that what we were talking about earlier about how you're shaped by things external to you. I'm always very interested in money, and I'm interested in history, and I'm interested in technology. I'm interested in these things that do shape us, that are external to us. That alone is a pretty political point of view. That if a person is in a different place, they would be different, right? So if they were born into a different class, or they had a different gender, or whatever, all these things that do shape who we are and what we do and why we do them. One of the things with Eat the Document, where the woman is, the most overt political book, right, where she was just trying to think about the context for this behavior. So it's about this woman who's a Vietnam War protester, and you meet her at the beginning of the book after she's just done something and she's gone underground, and you don't find out till the end of the book what happened. Yeah, I know no one in Berkeley would be able to relate to this book at all. Try to reach. And then when I was writing it, I was, it's really before my time period, and I just kept thinking, I'm really interested in this aftermath of what happens when you've done something that has consequences, and a lot of fiction is about consequences. So it was interesting and compelling to me in that way, and the stakes are so high when you're having political actors. But a lot of times it's just that I'm interested in these characters who are trying to answer back in some way to they're really kind of morally challenged to answer back, whether it's Nick in Stone Arabia creating his alternative universe in which he is a real artist who has an audience and has success, instead of a real artist who has no audience and has no success. Or it's this woman who's trying to stop the war and becomes desperate and makes a terrible mistake that she regrets, and then she ironically can do no political activism because she's underground for the rest of her life. And so, I think there's a sense of characters striving and failing, and in Innocence and Others, there's a character who's trying to make herself be a better person in some ways. She's trying to change and she's failing, and I think that kind of humbling middle-age experience is very interesting to me, where you're looking back and you're realizing that idealistic 21-year-old wasn't right about everything. And yet here you are, and you still have to live, and you still have to figure it out. And that's very poignant and human, and those stories are really compelling to me. So that's not really answering your question.
But it's interesting, right? I love watching your minds at work, both of you guys. It's fascinating. I'm going to ask what you're reading now, because I always love that moment.
I just finished this. It's great. This is Jonathan Lethem's new book.
Oh, God.
Oh, wait a minute. Excuse me, guys. I want to get a shot of this. Would you hold that up? Come on, guys. We got to get this. All right.
What is it? And will I have to be jealous?
Oh, well. Oh, there it is. I'm waiting for mine. I don't know why I don't have it yet.
No, it's. I couldn't put it down. I read it in a binge. It was
so nice.
Great.
Thanks. That's great. Yeah. Well, so I'm just off teaching, and I'm just off teaching this, 1,300-page unfinished German novel that I've been reading and rereading obsessively for 6 months. So I was just telling Dana that I get summer vacation. I get to read all the things I've been anticipating, and I think probably at the top of the stack is DeLillo's new book, 0K, which I've, in past versions of my life, I would have read like the day it was published, because I was that obsessed with DeLillo. So it's weird for me to even have one sitting in my house unread, for a few months as I've had this, or for, I guess, 2 months. But I have a lot of summer reading that I'm excited about, and it's not all new stuff. I mean, I'm really honored, Dana. That was very nice. But part of the pleasure of getting, it's like a version of getting off the grid is breaking the the obnoxious tyranny of the just published. The idea that the only thing to read or think about or talk about is something that just came out. So,
except for our two books.
Except for our two books, which you must read and think about and talk about. But so, for me, the freedom the novel affords is partly to be outside of this commercial, world of making sure you're up to date and stuff. It's, the breaking news for me might be like recently. I've been filling in gaps in Graham Greene. I loved Graham Greene when I was a teenager, but I realized there were like a couple I hadn't read, and I was like, why not? And so I've been going and finding these. It means I'm reading like the obscure corners of his shelf, or Christina Stead, who writes these impossible, crazy, gigantic novels, and I love The Man Who Loved Children unduly, but I've only tackled a couple of the others. Well, so the other day, Luc Sant mentioned offhand that he was reading House of Many Nations, and it was like, Tolstoy writing a book about Wall Street, and I was like, why haven't I read House of Many Nations? So I'm going to go find this Christina Stead book this summer and sit on the beach and be in this place that it can actually, to me, be one of the most intoxicating sensations to be reading a novel and feeling like right now on the planet I might be the only person with this book in their hands. It's in that way it's
Not
different.
now.
In that way it's different from Dana's model of going to the movies and surrendering yourself to it, because there really aren't even others in the auditorium. But it's just you communing across time to this other brain that made this crazy artifact in language that's just sitting there unread until you activate it.
Yeah, but then the thing is, when you discover a book like that, a great book that you never got to, and then you realize that everyone else has commented on this book or engaged with it, and you start realizing, oh, that's what that person was talking about when they were talking about, and so you feel clicked into this whole new element of the past that you weren't able to read before. But I also think that there's something about when you're that I noticed too, that you go back to books that you've read before. And maybe this is another symptom of middle age, where you sort of like, wow, I read that book, but I don't remember very much of it. Right. It's practically like, now I got to go back and read. It becomes a new book. But while you're reading it, you remember. But what it is really interesting is how much you've changed in relationship to that book. So let's say a book like On the Road, which I read in high school, which meant a tremendous amount to me, and then going back and reading that book. And noticing that you don't like maybe some of the prose, or you're just still moved by this, or you totally misunderstood that. So I love this idea that there's these fixed objects that are really not fixed because they're changed by your own relationship to them. And I feel that way about movies. I was talking to Jonathan about showing my daughter old movies that I loved when I was a kid, and being sort of shocked. My dad has dementia, so he only likes to watch movies he's seen before, and we went over there and we're like, oh, let's go watch one of Dad's old favorite movies. We'll watch Gunga Din. And then I was like, holy shit, we can't watch this movie. And so some of it doesn't wear very well, but it's interesting to note that. It's interesting to note the difference in yourself and in the culture and the context. And some things endure. I mean, you can read Middlemarch and it will seem great today the way it seemed great, 100 years ago. And, Gunga Din, not so much. Although Cary Grant's very funny.
Cary Grant's I want to ask you each what you're working on now that we can look forward to, or maybe not, but you're working on. In terms of writing, your own writing.
It's easiest for me because I just sealed up the copy edits and so forth on this galley that Dana startled me by pulling out of her bag. It's that weird moment when it seems too soon to me that anyone could have read it, because
or that it exists.
Because I just finished it, and so I'm in the breath between real projects. But I'm doing journalism this summer instead. I just went to London to interview the filmmaker Adam Curtis, who made The Power of Nightmares, and I'm going to write a big piece about Adam Curtis for the Times Magazine. So that's like my summer project. Mm-hmm. While I read, because what I'm really going to do is fill the well back up by reading things in an unexpected and unplanned way, so that my subconscious can develop what my next real book wants to be. Yeah.
Dana?
I'm doing little nonfiction things and trying to feel my way toward a new novel.